Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on where you're calling in from. We've just started the webinar and we're just letting people make their way in. Let me just get myself settled here. And yes, so welcome everyone, and welcome to our final OECD Washington Center DC Global Shapers Future of Work Interactive Dialogue Series event, School to Work Transitions During COVID. My name is Danny Ryan from the OECD Washington Center, and it's great to have you here today with such an esteemed panel. Our goal with these webinars has been to discuss the policies, ideas, and actions that are shaping the future of work. Throughout this series, we have discussed reskilling, automation, entrepreneurship, and today we're discussing education. For the first time ever, the OECD is putting young people at the heart of this discussion with our recently launched Youth Consultation, which aims to provide tools to better understand these issues and contribute to the conversation. So if you are between 15 and 30, whatever your current situation or background may be, we would love it if you would share your thoughts with us by taking part in our survey. Your opinions and ideas will help shape the OECD's advice to policymakers. This series also supports the World Economic Forum's Davos Labs initiative, topic area of economy. We will make sure to post links to both of these campaigns in the chat. I want to say a big and final thank you to the DC Global Shapers for their enormous contribution throughout this series and for being such a brilliant partner. And we're looking forward to continuing our work with them. We hope you enjoy today's event. And with that said, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Neha Dalal, current graduate student at Stanford, Forbes 30 Under 30 in Education and Global Shaper. Neha, thank you so much for moderating today's session. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Danny. Super excited for this conversation. As you all know, we'll be discussing how to improve the school to work transition pipeline, especially during COVID. And I am incredibly excited to be joined by a phenomenal group of panelists here today. Now, they're all incredibly accomplished, and if I were to lay out their entire biographies, we would be here all day. So I'm going to stick to the highlights, but I'm sure you can learn far more about them over the course of our conversation tonight. So first, we have Anthony Mann. He is a senior policy analyst for education and skills at OECD. Second, we have Suzanne Fortier, principal and vice-chancellor at McGill University, and co-chair of the World Economic Forum Global Future Council on the new agenda for education and skills. We're also going to be joined by Arlane Gordon-Bray, strategy consultant and co-founder of the Twin Cities Catalyst collab, IZONE community engagement partner at Edgecombe County Public Schools, and a World Economic Forum Global Shaper. And finally, but certainly not least, Claire Fisher, co-founder and CEO of The Arena, which helps organizations reimagine the school to work pipeline, and a TFA alum as well. So over the course of the panel today, we're gonna get a chance to hear from each of our expert panelists and then go into some Q&A. So please be sure to use the chat to add any questions that you want us to answer and address tonight, and I'll be moderating that conversation. Without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Anthony Mann.
Thank you so much, Neha. Let me just put my slides up. Hopefully you can all see them now. Is that good? Excellent. Okay, so let me start. So I work at the OECD, and we're super interested in the question of career readiness in the pandemic, because in most economic downturns, young people are particularly badly affected. And we are kind of very much aware that over the next few years, we may see a return to very high levels of youth unemployment across the whole of the OECD. And our question is, can schools do anything to help prevent and reduce youth unemployment? So that's our key question. I'm going to present to you some work which is developing some really important insights into what schools can do. And this is going beyond high levels of qualifications or high level of mathematical skills, which in general associate with better work outcomes. But are there things which they can do to help and support better school to work transitions for all learners, regardless of their achievement ability? So let me quickly talk you through our methodology. We did an initial analysis of the PISA 2018 survey. So this is a survey of 79 countries, of 15-year-olds, thousands of 15-year-olds in those countries. And we asked some huge amounts of questions, some of which are about their career ambitions. And we find that they're very narrow, they're confused, they're distorted by social background. And actually at Davos, with the World Economic Forum last year, we published our first paper, saying that something seemed to be awry here. And then secondly, we did a literature review, because we were kind of asking, does career guidance work? Can schools really do anything to help young people prepare? And how can we know this for certain? And our approach to doing this is to use national longitudinal data sets. Now, these are surveys which follow young people from childhood into adulthood. And you've got lots and lots of different questions in there, which you can then sort of like use to make sure that you can isolate the interventions. You can control for their gender, control for their qualifications, you can control for their social economic background. And we found in our literature review that there are some consistent patterns across the reviews of national longitudinal data sets. And what they show is that they do seem to be indicators of better teenage career preparation. And I'm going to share some of them with you in a moment. Now, our next step is to say, well, the research literature is all about Australia, UK, US, the Anglophone countries. Let's see if we can commission new analysis to see if we can start talking about universal indicators of better preparation. And so currently we have people who are researching databases in Australia, Canada, China, Denmark, Germany, Korea, Switzerland, the UK and the US and Uruguay. And we're looking at young people when they're about 15, and looking at them sort of like 10 years later, 5 years later, 15 years later. And we're looking at data sets which follow young people over a long period of time, particularly during periods of recession. And so what we're looking for is, can we find a relationship between career-related attitudes and experiences and better earnings than we would expect, better NEET rates, which means better employment rates, better whether they're employed or unemployed, and are they more satisfied with their jobs and their career progression? And we can say, are they doing better than we would expect for somebody with that level of qualification, for that level of that type of social background? And going forward, what we're going to be doing is creating some data-driven tools for policy and practice. We're going to launch those in October. And, we're hoping to develop this work further during 2022, 2023. And so this is the website if you want to find out the detail of everything I'm going to present now. So let me present to you the emerging indicators which we have. Now, each of these, we find that in at least 3 countries, using at least 3 national longitudinal data sets, we find a positive relationship between, this is a teenage characteristics, and young people doing better later on in the labour market. So let me just quickly run through these, whether the young person is, certain about or uncertain about their job expectations, where the level of ambition which they present, whether they're planning the education needed for their job goal, whether they align their attitudes about being able to connect, learning with employment outcomes, whether they would agree that, working hard at school will help me get a good job. That shows the difference, just how popular, their career aspirations are. And so there's a bunch of things around thinking about the future, which are related with better outcomes. We see another collection of things which are related to better outcomes in terms of the extent to which they're exploring the future, including even things like career conversations or occupational exploration, particularly career development activities. And then finally, are they experiencing their future? Are they actually having experience of workplaces, whether by part-time employment, by internships or volunteering? And I'm going to show you, firstly, a little bit of a little bit of an example of some of the data which we're looking at. And so here are a number of studies. I don't have time to go into them in detail. What you see up here at the top is that for this question of certainty and uncertainty, we've got 11 different studies across 3 different countries from our literature, which find a relationship between certainty and doing better in the labour market than you'd expect. And just a few things to pick out here. In this Australian study, we see earnings 6% higher. In this UK study, we see impacts up to the age of 34. You know, often with these longitudinal studies, it's a bit frustrating because the way that the data is set up and analysed means that it's a binary. It's either yes, no, do they do better or worse? We don't really know the impact. But when we do have data about the impact, often it can be really quite high. So here we look at this question of career alignment. This is when you understand the education needed to meet your career ambition. And, you know, here we see for an example, you know, maybe 90% more likely to be not in education if you're misaligned. And here we can see career ambition. And I'm kind of like aware of the time, so I think these slides are going to be made available. And you know, it's you know, it's important that people have the opportunity to really look at the kind of the raw research which goes into this work. So these are our indicators. Our question is, to what extent are young people currently exhibiting those indicators? Well, here's the first one, career uncertainty. First thing to see here, this is our figures from 2018 and 2000. Here is our OECD average. In 2018, much higher, 81% higher than they were in 2000. Uncertainty is growing. Uncertainty is particularly an issue for low achieving boys. Low achievers in general, but we find boys in particular are much more likely to be uncertain. And these are young people who are actually going to go into the labour market, you know, relatively early. They're probably not planning on going to university. And we ask them, what job do you expect to do? And in big numbers, here's the United States. We have 34% of them saying that they don't know. You know, they're just not sure what job they plan to be doing. Here again, in terms of career alignment, we find here the US is on the kind of the right side of the scale. That's partly because ambitions here in the US are so high. But again, we have some big numbers. Here's the OECD average for the bottom quarter. Socioeconomic status, the most, you know, kind of deprived, disadvantaged children, 35% of them underestimate the education needed to meet their career ambition. So kids tend to have high ambitions, but what they often don't know is what the education is they need to be able to achieve them. Here we look at career development activities. Here's the OECD average, and we find that only half have spoken to a career advisor at school, 40% have visited a job fair. And what we'd expect, given these indicators, is that we want to have, you know, close to 100% of young people, you know, participating in these sorts of activities, exhibiting this sort of thinking. And then career conversations, you'd expect that, you know, all young people would agree that they'd, by the age of 15, they spoke to somebody about a job of interest, but that's not the case. You know, here we see in Italy, it's fewer than 70%. You know, we've got 25% to 30% of kids who are not having these conversations. If you look at teenage employment, in many countries that's reducing. And then if you look at teenage volunteering, it's high in somewhere like the United States, but low in countries like Italy and Portugal. And so, you know, here what we see is that in this work, we've been able to identify indicators of better adult employment outcomes. We're testing now the extent to which they exist in non-English speaking countries. But this is a resource. And you think, well, how can we use this resource? And we can use this, you know, kind of this insight from the big data to create data-driven tools for policy and practice, to assess whether teenagers are on track for optimal employment outcomes, to enable the design of career development programs, to assess whether, you know, the activities they take part in can be expected to be successful, to enable comparisons between countries, to identify patterns of structural disadvantage, and to enable national reviews of practice. Now, you know, this is our next steps. And you may ask, well, you know, why hasn't this been done before? And it hasn't been done before because it's very expensive, you know, kind of to do this analysis in so many different countries. And, you know, we've been fortunate to identify funding here, which allowed us to do this. And we were lucky that we have the PISA 2018 data, so we can actually test immediately, you know, how young people compare between countries. But the headline, I think, from the work that we're presenting here is that, can schools do more? They can do a lot more to help young people prepare for their transitions in this increasingly difficult labour market.
Thank you so much for that, Anthony. That's a really, really interesting collection of data and statistics from your research. So very much grateful for that information to level set us all. With that, I want to move over to Suzanne, who is going to speak from her experience working in this space.
Okay, thank you, Neha. Et bonjour à vous tous, c'est un plaisir d'être ici. I want to take you back to pre-COVID days, and I hope you can all remember what that looked like, because I want to talk about the transition from school, universities to work. And one of the things I want to share at the outset is that this transition was difficult, even pre-COVID, and even from students graduating from what are taught as the best schools. And so we've been thinking about this, how to make this transition easier for quite a long time. What is the problem, we might ask? And it seems, I haven't done the kind of analysis that Anthony is doing, but mobility of the workforce is certainly one of the problems. People are unlikely to spend the whole of their career in one place. The employers know that, and so they've reduced considerably the amount of training they're willing to do when they welcome a new employee. And we can understand them. They feel, why should I train a person? I will make them more attractive for the competitor, and I will lose this employee. And so the decrease in on-the-job training is really quite significant. What the companies want, what the employers want, is what they call turnkey ready employee. From day one, you're ready to do the job. They don't want to train you. Well, how do you become turnkey ready when you haven't had a job before, when it's your first job? And so what we see here in Canada, and remember, this is a place where we have extremely, pre-COVID days, extremely low unemployment rate. Everybody's looking for employees, but they're not willing to employ you if you don't have any experience. And so it is a problem for people to find that very first job. Once you have the experience, of course, the table turns, and now the companies will do all they can to retain you if they think you're a good employee. But that first job is really really hard to get. And that's something that all of the universities have really focused on. We need to give our students the kind of opportunities from day one in first year that will get them in the transition from study to work. So opportunities to hone their skills in entrepreneurship and innovation, to hone their inter and intrapersonal skills, teamwork, leadership, communication, cultural awareness. These are all the things that they have to start, and many of them, of course, come equipped with those skills already from their high school experience. But we need to really put that in the curriculum and in the experience they'll have in our universities. So what are the kinds of things we can do? Well, one of the things, and this is a very much a Canadian experience here, the structure of our academic year. At McGill, this is the last week of class. Students will be out before the end of April. They have 4 months to, we hope, take a bit of vacation time, they deserve it, but also to work. And so they get experience in the workforce right from the beginning. We also are building work integrated learning experiences, so internship, networking, and mentorship. Great alumni are willing to help in that regard, or people here in our community. Of course, entrepreneurship and innovation hubs. And so students participate very much in these activities. And of course, community involvement and initiatives where they also build those skills, particularly in social innovation. So this is how we can help. Now, COVID times has, of course, disrupt some of these activities, but not completely. In fact, what has happened with those kinds of activities during COVID is that, as we did with delivering the academic program, we pivoted very, very rapidly to a virtual environment. And many of our students are continuing these activities, but in the virtual world. They don't like it as much, I think, as in person, but there are some advantages. They can be mentored by people who are absolutely exceptional on the other end of the world, which they could not in our community. The other thing I would say, and this is again from a perspective of Canada, our government is very preoccupied with not leaving a COVID permanent scar on young people. So they made interventions, they've made investments to create jobs for our students in the summer, to create opportunities for additional education and so on. they really don't want to see that generation have the permanent scar because they're the future of our country. And so that is important that at the policy level, our governments pay attention to that. I want to end with two things. The first one is that Canada is a very good country in many ways when you think about the transition from study to work because of our demography. We're an aging society. We are eager to recruit talent. All of the employers want talent. And so it's a good country. We need workforce. The biggest problem in Canada is finding people for the jobs we have. And we are already seeing, even though the pandemic is not over, that this is returning very fast. This is not the situation across the world. In many other countries, there are many, many talented people and few jobs and few opportunities. So that is something to keep in mind. The world is not the same. It's not, I call it the world is not flat. It's very peaky, in fact, in terms of opportunity. Not peaky in terms of talent, but in terms of opportunity, it's very peaky. The other thing is that when we think of all of those various activities, we need to remind ourselves that even in a country like Canada, we have people who will find it more difficult to make the transition. And so we need to pay attention to those people in those opportunities while they're with us. We're not rid of discrimination or unconscious bias. And this is true in Canada, this is true around the world. And so let's pay attention to that when we have these opportunities. And the last thing I want to say is that I think you all know that you're global shapers. You need to shape your future. This is, and take advantage of those opportunities because this is how you will, I'm sure, create your own job. And even better, you'll create not only your job, but many more jobs for other people. And I think many of us look at you, your generation, as the future of the world, the shapers of the world, with a lot of confidence in what you can do. So I will say bon courage, but also thanks. We all, I think, have a lot of gratitude for people in your generation because we know what you're capable of. We know of your talent and your commitment, and we know how important your job is in the future.
Thank you so much for that, Suzanne. I think it's always so important in these conversations to actually hear from someone who's at one of these universities doing the hard work that needs to be done. So with that, I want to turn it over to Arlane.
Thank you so much. Oh, thank you so much, Neha. I just saw something on the screen. I wanted to make sure I'm here. So I have the privilege of working for Edgecombe County Public Schools as the community industry engagement partner. Just to give you a sense of where we are geographically, I am in the eastern part of North Carolina, about an hour outside of our capital and 3 hours south of the nation's capital. And we are a beautiful community that fully supports everyone that is here. We are about 90% Black and Latinx. But I will also say we are very economically disadvantaged. And so I know when many other people from around the world think of like, what does disadvantage in the US mean? Just to let you know, we've got food insecurity that is rampant out here. 30% of my kids do not have internet access in their home. We do have higher unemployment rates than the national average. 10 to 15% of our adults have college education, which is about 10% percentage points lower than the rest of the country. And so, within K through 12 systems, we have a focus of creating resilient people that are going to be able to meet the future of work, whether we know what that looks like or not, and resilient people that will create resilient communities, because we, have seen out here many times where whether it's the recession, whether it's a pandemic, that our recovery is going to take longer and the effects that has on us overall. The pandemic has definitely highlighted, again, like what we already knew in K through 12 education, which is that the systems are not working in so many ways. And there's an over-reliance on our education systems and educators to be creating resilient humans for the future. The current systems, especially in the US around education, were designed in the early 1900s to meet early 1900s industrial needs. That of course means that they are prepared for outdated professional ecosystems and what is considered career and work. And then we know that they are steeped in gender bias and racism. Education innovation now, especially what we're doing here in our feeder pattern, is focused on redesigning schools to better suit the needs of the students and supporting those communities. So this is about thinking about what does work look like, but also how are we addressing the traumas that exist for our students and for our families. That means thinking about, the pandemic pointed out that childcare needs, parents in the home, weren't able to work with students out of school. Thinking about food insecurity. We had to continue to deliver lunches, even though our kids could not come to school. We were delivering lunches 5 days a week to ensure that our students were able to eat so that they could actually learn, and providing additional food for families due to unemployment that happened due to the pandemic. We also have to just, in general, think about how does racism and poverty affect our students so they can still learn in the classroom. So when we think about these challenges, our educators already have to meet national standards. They have to understand the science of learning and how that affects students. And they need to be able to support the immediate needs of students and families. And then also now we think about how do we prepare them for a future of work where, one, we don't even know what the jobs of our middle schoolers are going to be in the next 5 years, much less our educators have any experience to be able to bring our students along and understanding what that career progression would look like. And when we talk about like giving more professional development for our teachers, one example that I have to give is I've got a teacher in horticulture who we actually found was babysitting the 3-year-old brother of one of our students so that she could learn, and so that this high schooler wouldn't actually just be forced to sit at home and babysit, but that she could be in the classroom. So when we think about putting that sort of responsibility additionally on having educators understand what does it mean for a student to be a data scientist in the future? What does it mean for them to understand what a career in machine learning means when, again, like so many of our teachers and educators are also trying to meet basic needs, and we can, the elephant in the room is they're just not being paid enough to do this kind of work. And so part of when we think about what are our policy solutions, they've also got to be on industry and government to learn to meet us where they're at. First, everyone was educated in a school, and a lot of in public schools, and so they think they understand what school is. It's completely different from what many of us used to think that it was, and especially those of us that have had the privilege of really good education experiences. One, we need to re-enter the classroom to understand what is actually happening in the classroom now, what are we teaching and what's being learned, and what are the gaps that exist. There's some tactical connections that need to happen. We have seen the challenges of Zoom and internet. Like I said, 30% of my kids do not have internet access. I've got parents and families that are in parking lots till 9 p.m. to finish homework. And so when we just think about the investment that needs to be made to ensure that families and students just even have access to a broader world, to have an understanding of what can possibly exist, that's one basic need. We also need to think about better connections for educators to understand the world of work. Again, how are we paying educators more so that we can bring in folks from different backgrounds and different industries to consider being an educator in a K-12 system as a part of their portfolio of their work experience? One of the things that we had from our Global Shapers report in the future of work is that millennials and Gen Xers, Zers, they understand that work is not about going to a job for 30 years. You're going to have 5 to 7 careers in that career portfolio. What does it look like to have to enter the classroom as a part of that portfolio or increase those connections? And additionally, we know for many different reasons, education is not given the same professional appreciation as others are, and that needs to be that's a whole different discourse and discussion that needs to happen to ensure that we have better pathways that happen for our students. And so I guess our last point is just around like how are we increasing the pipeline of support that happens there and getting also industries to meet us where we're at. The unfortunate part of what Suzanne said is that businesses want turnkey employees, when in fact, we need businesses to make investments on employees that may need some additional training, not just in a job, but additional training in just how are they a resilient human that is going to be able to participate and add to the world of work. And the last point is, work is still 85% of jobs are made through connections. LinkedIn has published that report. What does it look like of how we are increasing these connections? One, to ensure that we're increasing diversity and economic mobility across our countries that are here. So thank you. Looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you so much for that, Arlane. I think your story about the babysitting teacher is really gonna stick with me for a while. Thanks so much for sharing. Beyond schools, like those that Arlane and Suzanne are at, there are a number of other organizations working on this pipeline. So I next want to turn it over to Claire, who is running one of these organizations, to hear a little bit more from that perspective.
Thanks so much, Neha. So first, I think it's interesting to hear from Suzanne, the higher ed perspective, and from Arlane, the K-12 perspective. And our organization, which is called the Arena Inc., is a small nonprofit that works across the US on strengthening the school to work pipeline. And so we sort of have a two-tiered service model, and actually developed the first tier during COVID in response to some vulnerabilities that we noticed with students. But we have a product that helps individuals find resources, and then we have a partnerships practice that helps us collaborate, or helps institutions collaborate across sectors. So if we're thinking about strengthening the school to work pipeline, we're thinking about it from a kind of direct to consumer way, and then also from strengthening connections across sectors for institutions. And kind of in a normal world, ideally, individuals have options, and students or youth and Gen Z ages 16 to 26 can understand what their post-secondary options are and then what their career options are, and be able to think about making a plan. And there's no sort of stigma about nonlinear paths, that, if you go to work right away and then you earn a degree later, that's something that's socially acceptable. And hopefully in a normal world, there's normalized coordination across sectors. So schools are working really well with alternative training providers and colleges and employers, because when we see that they don't do that, students often fall through the cracks. So then enter COVID, and I think some of these threats or risks are just even more apparent. Students, have fewer options. We have a lot of kids coming back to us saying sort of like, we can't go to college right now. Actually, we need to work to help our family earn more, or we don't want to go to college. We're paying extra to learn in our parents' basement. And, there are 5 different people working in one room. This is not what we signed up for. And it's a lot to balance all of those things at once, and not the kind of promise that a lot of educators sold students, rightfully so. And so kind of the need felt even more apparent for more options to exist, and more flexible options to allow students to earn an income and be able to try to earn a degree at the same time. And then we noticed for organizations in the pandemic, they're often kind of constraining their purse strings and just focusing on the perceived core business, which often doesn't include training young people that might need a little bit more to get up to speed, like the other panelists have mentioned. So I think what we saw was, they're vulnerable communities that we work with enter a crisis, they're even more vulnerable, and institutions aren't kind of extending their hand to be able to strengthen that pipeline. I think there are a couple opportunities and silver linings that we've seen, though, that I wanted to mention. So when we think about school to work, we often think about schools and employers on either side. In the middle, I think about conduits, which are often alternative training programs or more traditional ones like like colleges and universities. And what we saw during the pandemic was more of a normalized set of alternatives in the States. So everybody had to start relying on online education, and that became just a little bit more normal and a little less of sort of like this alternative route, which allows for students to think about, you know, maybe I'll earn an IT certificate or pursue medical assisting and then earn a degree later, or maybe I'll get a job right now and try to earn my associate's or bachelor's degree at the same time. Just this sort of greater ecosystem of possibilities and of examples of kind of taking different routes into work that might accommodate students better. And then another silver lining is that a lot of students are working. Granted, they're in blue collar jobs, they're not in white collar jobs, and they're in jobs where there's not a ton of growth potential. And so we'd want to enable different pathways into jobs with more of a growth trajectory so they can build a career. But many more students are working than they were in the past because, like, sort of by necessity. And I think that gives us a lot of examples of kind of what do young people, like what are some really successful habits that they're building in the workplace that we can build on. And I think, you know, what we're noticing moving forward is that for each stakeholder group, there's sort of a set of habits that we would like to see from them. So like the other panelists mentioned, we need for employers to invest in young people, not just employers that are hiring them right now. And in the States, the Black Lives Matter movement was a pretty useful catalyst for employer involvement in diversifying talent pipelines. And so, you know, whether it starts as a CSR initiative and then builds to something where employers perceive this as really core to the economic engine of their business, we need to see that happening now. Training providers, there are a bunch more alternative training providers. They're working more with upskilling adults than they are with young people. So we'd like for them to start opening up their programs and figuring out the kind of more supportive coaching models in order to be able to train an 18-year-old and not just a 35-year-old. And like the others have mentioned, we'd really love for schools to try to think about equipping students with a longer term vision and set of resources. So they're thinking about building a career and where different educational experiences might serve that career rather than saying, go to college and then figure stuff out later, which often happens. And I think it's just, you know, it's hard. The pandemic has, I think, like really depleted energy in a lot of the institutions that we worked with. And there have been different kind of waves of hope. And there's a lot more hope right now. But I think some recognition from support organizations like us and others that being able to step in wherever we can to provide resources and alleviate stress and really work together as we come out of this is going to be critical for our young people. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Claire. I was really intrigued by the silver linings you laid out too, in particular. So with that, we're gonna turn over to the moderated conversation part of this panel. For those of you following here on Zoom, feel free to throw questions in the chat. For those of you following on Facebook Live, feel free to add questions via the comments section, and I will weave those into our conversation. But I wanted to start with a question for all of our panelists. You know, all of you mentioned changes that COVID is going to bring about. Claire, you guys have even introduced an entire new tier at your place. And I'm curious, which of these changes do you think are going to persist and endure past COVID? And in what ways are we going to revert back to the old way of doing things? And any of you feel free to jump in and start us off here.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I'll say a few things. We are looking as an employer, but also for our students at new models of work. There's no question that we've learned that there are different kinds of models of work and ones that may fit better people's lives and in terms of their own personal life, their own responsibility. And I think this will stay post-COVID. I'm also hoping very much that our awareness of what it looks like to live through a global crisis will provide the incentive we need to change our economies to become greener economies. Our toll on the planet is far too high, and this is the big crisis facing us. So I think we will have that. These are, I'd say, the fairly certain things that we're seeing. I must say the market has behaved in such a funny, unpredictable way that I can't predict what will happen in terms of jobs. But the one thing I would say is that we will certainly keep a digital environment in many of the way we learn, work, and so on. And so this is good news for younger people because you're digitally born. You know how to live in this environment, and people want to have you bring those skills and this knowledge into the work of the environment of work. So I think this will stay too.
Anthony, I see you have your hand raised. Go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think where we are at the moment is that we're in a really sort of like dynamic situation in terms of demand for labour in the economy, where it's dynamic, which is, I guess, is a nice way to say that it's all over the place because of the pandemic, but also because we see some really significant changes for another couple of reasons. One is, as Suzanne mentions, climate change. And as we start gearing up our global infrastructure for tackling climate change, we're going to see changes in patterns of demand, some very substantial, but also automation. And automation, you know, the OECD analysis suggests that the biggest impact of automation is going to be, you know, changing how jobs are arranged as much as jobs completely disappearing and new ones emerging. So we're going to see some of that, and we're already seeing some of that. But the big thing is kind of the change in the dynamics. And what this means is that for young people, we need them to have a greater sense of agency and understanding as they sort of go through their education system. And, you know, these are what the indicators are really pointing towards, that where young people are thinking about their future, where they're actively exploring and experiencing workplaces, they're developing the capacity to have a sense of agency and control in relating their education to an imagined self later on in work. And in order to be able to have confidence there, they need, as Arlane was saying, they need to have first-hand, you know, encounters with the labour market. You know, it's much more important for them to speak to employers and to hear directly from employers in order to be able to understand how these changes are influencing those workplaces. And we saw actually in the UK, you know, recently a survey of university students, a very good quality survey. And, you know, a very high percentage of those students found out that by the time they got to the age of 18, you know, they'd already dropped subjects or they didn't have sufficiently high grades in order to be able to do the course they really wanted to do. And 40% of them wanted more career guidance in order to be able to make more informed decisions. And in these recessionary situations when things are so dynamic, our young people today are staying in education longer and longer. And this pandemic will drive more of them into education, but they need the information to make good investment decisions, which are right for them as individuals. And that's why we need to take this agenda far more seriously now than probably have done over the last 20 years.
Claire and Arlane, anything you two want to add?
I will say, I think one unfortunate bright spot that's still going to take a while is that we had a better understanding of the rural versus urban divide in terms of internet access and what does that mean for education and jobs. I've got another random anecdote where I had a parent that was able to get a job that was an online remote working job, but the internet speeds just weren't fast enough for them to actually let her maintain employment. And we also just see that with the cost even in urban centers around broadband internet access. And so though not the subject of the panel, it would be great to start thinking about internet as a utility as we are now seeing that it, you know, is closer to a right that is needed by everyone. And I think a bright spot that we have seen out of the pandemic, going to student and autonomy and agency, students are learning a lot from TikTok and other online spaces that they're supplementing their education wise. We're not able to afford an art teacher. And yet I've got a number of students that through TikTok and other online spaces have been teaching themselves or kind of self-teaching different art mediums, which is, you know, always fantastic to see. One that I do fear is that our teachers and other educators, you know, are burned out, and we'll see how much longer that lasts. There is a concern that there's just going to be a continuation of that to go on to next year instead of a real realization about just how much is happening in education centers that are supporting society.
And I would also add that I think two parts. One, just to respond to kind of student agency and understanding uncertainty that folks were mentioning, is just the like removal of shame around not knowing what you want to do. So I think what I've seen in the past year through TikTok and others is just this greater emphasis on flexibility and different ways to balance your schedule, earn income, what's your side hustle, like how are you as a young person doing multiple things, and other young people encouraging that. And to the extent that we as adults or as institutions can also encourage that or allow students to kind of bring their whole self into school and grapple with the different pieces of their life as they plan their future, I think that will strengthen their own plan and their ability to achieve their goals. And then I think just environmentally in general, the greater emphasis on flexibility will stick around. And there's some concern that if people aren't going into work, that you might feel a greater imposter syndrome if you don't look like the people that you work with, and employers might struggle with retention of non-traditional candidates. So I think there's kind of a flip side of that institutions need to grapple with, but a benefit just sort of being that there are lots of different ways of working and ways of balancing your schedule.
So a couple of you brought up in your opening remarks a difference in opinions between business and schools, and I want to delve into that a little bit more. In particular, I'm curious to hear what you all think is the best distribution of where schools should be taking the lead and where other partners, nonprofits, business, government should be taking the lead. And Suzanne and Arlane, given your work in higher ed and K-12 respectively, I would love to hear from you two first, and then Claire and Anthony would like to hear your responses after that.
Arlane, do you want to start, or do you want me to start?
I'm giving it over to you, Suzanne.
Okay, so this is a topic that I find very interesting. We've had a lot of discussions in Canada about the perspective and from higher education and from the business. As I said, the business will want turnkey ready employees. And we can understand that it's a very competitive world and they want the top employees. And we from the university sector, I've been telling them, if we prepare students to be ready for the job today, we're not preparing them for the future. And we all talk about this future, that a future of job is going to be recreated in at least every 3 to 5 years. So we need to prepare people for the longer term. That's our job in universities. So after, I think, too many years of debate around that and pointing fingers at each other, we finally found a way to work together. And we have, in fact, a business higher education roundtable in Canada. And that's where a major initiative in Canada, which is the Work Integrated Learning Initiative, came from. The employers made the commitment of creating internship in their companies for students to go work in as a learning experience. And we made the commitment of preparing them for these internships. The commitment is very ambitious. We want every single student in our universities to have that, and colleges to have that kind of experience at least once during their period of study. This is a big commitment. So I think it was great that we had the debate and we had the finger pointing phase of all of that. But eventually we found a way that we can accommodate both, I think, the need to prepare young people for jobs, job ready, but I always say job ready and future ready. We cannot give up on future ready to have our students prepare for the job tomorrow. So I think that's in fact a good story. And I must say again, because there's an element of this that is public policy, the government did understand how important this was and chipped in financial ways to make that more possible. So I think this is a really a good story here that started with a bit of a disagreement.
I'm Suzanne, I think I'm with you. We need a more round tables for some finger pointing and fighting to get some better solutions. But I'll be honest, I'm actually struggling to think of like who, takes on more of that onus, right? And of course, educators and businesses and industry, we have two different motivations. Although we want many of our businesses now to have more social impact, their motivation is a bottom line. Whereas there are some more altruistic motivations that happen in the education sphere. And so there is a kind of always like a struggle and combat of like, what path do we go down? But I do think I'm always wanting to put more of the work on the industry because industry also has, I want to say, does have some more foresight into what is considered future ready to be able to bring and to connect to educators, and also just to be able to connect further with what is happening in the classroom, to have a better understanding of what kind of students are they going to get out, and just an increased dialogue in the professions overall would be just a helpful inroads to exist.
Claire and Anthony, do you agree, or do Suzanne and Arlane have it all wrong?
Shall I go first? Well, I mean, it's not that they've got it wrong at all, but I think there is, there's some wider nuances. Firstly, I guess I always talk about employers rather than business, because when we're thinking about it from the young person's perspective, ultimately they want to be able to, they're going to sell their labor in exchange for money. And that's in, hospitals, public services, third sector, as well as private business. And everybody's got a vested interest in this. And I've done lots of work in the past, trying to engage employers in education. And what I've always found is that there's always a strong latent interest, but they need to be asked. And they need to have a clear ask made of them. It needs to be easy for them to get involved. And I think, when that happens, we find that employers do respond. But, often you need intermediaries, third-party organizations to liaise between the two to make it happen. But it only works if the schools are in control. The teacher needs to decide that they're happy with what's happening. If they're not happy, then it doesn't happen. So that's when we need to start from that perspective. And I think in kind of thinking about the kind of the way that we're preparing young people for the future, we're in a turbulent environment, and we don't know how things are going to play out, but we do know that workplaces are changing, and different workplaces are changing in different ways, at different velocities. And so, work-related learning, work-based learning, where we allow young people to see for themselves what's happening in these different environments, is our way of trying to kind of future-proof them effectively by saying that, this is a taste of the way things are going to be. And we don't know that's for sure, but the more they have of this, and it's more variety they have of it, the better place they're going to be to, emotionally, psychologically, intellectually, to be able to be prepared, to be able to thrive in this this dynamic and uncertain world.
And I agree largely with what Arlane was talking about. And I think thinking about incentives is helpful because, one, I think schools and employers need to collaborate better, which means I think that each of them needs to, or an internal champion within each institution needs to care about doing a little bit more than what their organization's individual mission is. So that means schools caring a little bit more about where their kids are at age 25 than they might feel like they're held accountable for every single day with the kids in front of them. And it requires that employers go a little bit more or do a little bit more to build a different recruitment pipeline or think about what mentorship looks like in onboarding. And once the kind of like success loop is there, it's very clear that there's value provided to each institution. But I think it's first just saying, okay, schools know their students really well, and they know how to help students build habits around agency, around resilience, around, you know, solving unknown problems, around networking potentially. Like there are lots of things that can happen in schools. And then it's also building relationships with proximate employers, which just like isn't in your job description necessarily if you're teaching 11th grade science. And employers, I think sometimes, you know, if there's an org mandate to diversify workforce, but an entry-level recruiter is still trying to meet a quota, like the change is just not going to happen, or it's just going to take some time. So I think anything we can do to help organizations reflect their values in their org structure or in their own incentives will help enable this kind of flywheel to work.
Great. All right, we're nearing the end of our time. So a lot of folks in our audience are young leaders who want to make a change in this space. And I want to close on what advice all of you have for these young leaders. And Claire and Arlane, I would love if you two could start this one as young leaders in this space yourself.
That's a good question. Sorry, I was trying to be thoughtful about a response. I'm seeing, not that like I'm an expert or have a total bird's eye view, but just more examples of people in power caring about what young people think and what they're saying on TikTok, where they're spending their time, where they're spending their money. So even if as a young person, if you're starting with directing dollars and providing feedback to consumers, like I think there's a way to start to encourage more young people to speak up about what they want from employers, or like reach out to me and others and ask for help. I think we're entering a space where, you know, coming back from the pandemic a year after George Floyd and a lot of the kind of more always present, but like more visible examples of addressing racial equity. I think actually employers are in a position where they want to be able to step up and they want to be able to do the right thing and often just don't know how. And so I think if you're a young person, whether it's asking questions of the people within your circle or starting to speak up to employers or others, using your voice is powerful.
Claire, you gave me the inspiration I needed. I was not sure where I was thoughtfully going to go with that, but that was really helpful. Yeah, I would say speaking up, being authentic as a young leader. And, you know, this last year has just taught us a lot in terms of the world and where there's spaces for us to improve for each other. And it's given some folks a crash course in what is privilege. And so one thing that I always like to give to young people is, one, recognize what privilege do you have and how do you use your privilege to bring someone else to the table or whatever table you exist in. You know, for those of you that are struggling because you don't have a place of privilege that you're existing in, I'm not going to say just keep your head up because that is difficult. The real answer is take care of yourself, continue to look for opportunities for yourself, and don't be afraid of that. Like, you know, fearlessly try to create the world that you want to exist. The hard part about getting older, because I am not as young of a professional anymore as I should be, is that you just do become kind of less optimistic and become more a part of the systems that at one point that you rail against, continue to rail against the systems that you see are not working, that are oppressive. Continue to try to fight for a seat or just create your own table, because we do have those powers now to create new tables and bring along the folks that you believe have a voice there.
Suzanne and Anthony, what would you add?
Well, I agree with what has already been said by Arlane and Karen. They've said it very beautifully, in fact. What I would say is that, well, what I would add is the phrase I've heard most often in the last 6 months is, we need to build back better. Everybody's talking about building back better. And there's a lot of building needed to get better. So I would say to our young leaders, take a constructive approach. Don't be a critic sitting in the sideline. Get in the middle of it and be doers and do build back better. That's what I would say. We need you so much. I think this is something among the different generations that I see, is that the older generation fully understand how much we need our young people to be in there and take leadership. So take it.
And let me just add, kind of like way of signing things off, is that so as far as we're aware that, you know, the indicators which we've identified at 15 probably will apply at 25. You know, it's about locus of control, it's about a sense of agency, it's about openness, it's about strategic thinking, it's about you know, exploring and, you know, seeking opportunities to experience, you know, different worlds, different workplaces, and from that grows great confidence. But I think there's something really fundamental, which you know, which is, I think, good advice for, you know, kind of these leaders of the future, which is, you know, can really think about the opportunities to get involved in education. You know, if you had a privileged background, a privileged education, you know, go see if you can get opportunity to go to disadvantaged schools and see what the barriers are there, and to develop relationships there. And I think that's hugely important. And when people are sort of like controlling organizations, think about how you can connect with schools. You know, because we have a, you know, in these turbulent times, you know, as schools and employers have grown further apart, we need to try and bring them back together and do that in multiple ways.
Thank you all so much. You know, the school to work pipeline, it's flawed, it's changing, it's incredibly critical, but how can you not feel inspired to work on it after hearing all of that? So thank you to our fantastic panelists. All 4 of you guys have been amazing. I've learned a lot. Thank you to Danny and the OECD team for putting this all together. This has been a delight, this entire 4-panel series. And lastly, thank you to our audience for tuning in and joining the conversation here. As Danny mentioned at the beginning, if you want to continue the conversation with us, please do so by giving us your thoughts as young leaders in this space. And with that, have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday, however long it is, depending on where you are.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you to you, Neha.